Welcome to the History of European Theatre podcast, and thanks for joining me on this journey through millennia of theatrical history. Episode 141, The Life of Ben Jonson, Part 1. It's Complicated. Last time, I concluded my look at Shakespeare's very earliest plays with The Comedy of Errors. A good place to pause on Shakespeare, I think, as we now have a sample of his history plays, his comedies, and one tragedy, which certainly are not typical of his best work, but, I hope, gave you a sense of how understanding the context in which the plays were created can help to explain why they are what they are. If you did not consider it before listening to the last few episodes, you will also have become aware of how the question of authorship of plays during this period is extremely complex. The playhouses, and probably the taverns and the lodgings in early modern London, were a soup of creativity, with hands involved in plays other than their ascribed creator that we can now detect, and, I'm sure, many that we cannot. For me, none of this detracts from the work, and only encourages the interest in just how the creative process worked. I hope we can all throw off some of those Victorian shackles that held Shakespeare quite so high above his contemporaries, and acknowledge the debt that he owed to some of them at least. None of these plays so far are considered Shakespeare's best, and we can pick at the flaws in them and mitigate them thanks to his youth and inexperience. But I do still consider that they are worthy of our attention, in some cases because of those very flaws, and the questions they raise about the creative impulses and processes of Shakespeare, his contemporaries, and his Elizabethan mind. By introducing his contemporary, his rival for greatness, now we get another view of the world, another perspective, and one that, I hope, will give an even greater understanding of Shakespeare and the other playwrights of the period. However, there are complexities about our understanding of Ben Jonson that mean that before tackling his life story, I need to put how that story comes to us in some context. So today, I'm going to look at some of the historiography that surrounds Jonson, how we come to know about his life and character, and give you an idea of how much of that we can trust. By the end of his life, Jonson was a very important literary figure, admired by many and a favourite of King James, a much more revered figure in his time than Shakespeare ever was, so, of course, he is more documented than any other playwright of his time. But still, we only have glimpses of his life and personality amidst a lot of empty spaces. Like I said, it's complicated. So, to begin with, let me tell you about some events nearer the end of his life than the beginning, which are a significant source for us. In 1618, Ben Jonson visited William Drummond at his Scottish estate, Hawthornden. Thanks to Drummond's records of the visit and a comment in a surviving letter, we know that Jonson undertook this journey on foot. The exact reasons which induced Jonson to undertake that long and no doubt exhausting pilgrimage from London to Edinburgh are not known precisely, but they resulted in Drummond recording snippets of their conversations, and those form an important and significant source for what we know about Jonson's life and opinions. Well, maybe they do. It's complicated. Such a journey would be no light undertaking in those days, even for a young man in good condition. It is a distance measured by road today of nearly 400 miles, and Google Maps tells me that it is an 8.5-day walk. Even in my youth, I think I would have given that one a miss, and Jonson was 46 by then, relatively elderly for the time when a death in the 50s would not have been considered unusual. It is recorded that he weighed 19 stone 11 pounds, that's a portly 278 pounds. And first and second-hand reports suggest his usual life was London-based and a sedentary one, where his favourite pastime was to be propped up in the Mermaid Tavern, drinking and discussing life and art with friends. Above and beyond the recording of his words by Drummond, it is interesting to consider why he undertook what must have been a very uncomfortable trip for him. What uprooted this unwieldy poet from his chair by the fireside at the Mermaid Inn? Well, one suggestion, prompted by a comment in a letter that he made the journey for his own gain, is that he was fulfilling the terms of a bet. Much as gambling probably played a big part in London life at the time, this does seem a very extreme wager, and one that Jonson would have been unlikely to take, even if considerably drunk at the time. So, fun as the idea is, let's put that to one side. Just possibly, he desired to visit the home of his ancestors, who by his own account came from Annandale, which, although towards the west coast of Scotland, was a relatively close 70 miles from Edinburgh. However, given the family history that you will hear, I'm not sure that he was so interested in his ancestry as to make such a trip, and by enforcing himself into such a long walk. A horse would be quicker, assuming a sturdy steed could be found, and a carriage or a cart more comfortable if the purpose was just to get to Scotland. It may have been that he went north by the command of King James, or at any rate in obedience to his Majesty's wishes. James had revisited Scotland in the previous year as part of his agreement with Scottish lords to make regular return visits to his original kingdom. It was a promise more honoured in the breach than in the observance, but this visit may have suggested to Jonson the idea of following in his royal master's footsteps. In a letter written to Drummond after his return, on the 10th of May 1619, Jonson said, "I am arrived safely with a most Catholic welcome, and my reports not unacceptable to his Majesty. He professed, I thank God, some joy to see me, and is pleased to hear the purpose of my book." That book would seem to have been an account of the history and antiquities of Scotland. Jonson goes on to ask Drummond some follow-up questions about detail on things that he observed on tour. The government of Edinburgh, the differences between the customs of the universities of St Andrews and those of Edinburgh University, that sort of thing. It's also possible that the book was intended to be a record of his journey through the entire kingdom, and therefore the need to walk the route north in order to record observations of local life for the king's benefit, as a way of showing the unity of England and Scotland under James. Unfortunately, the drafts he had worked on were destroyed in a fire along with many of his other papers, so we don't know exactly what the contents were intended to be. Besides collecting material for an official or semi-official book for James, Jonson seems to have also been gathering ideas for one or two works of his own. He confided to Drummond that he is to write his foot pilgrimage hither, and to call it a discovery, and also that he hath intention to write a pastoral play, and set the stage of it in the Lowland Lake. It's also suggested that Jonson may have been discontented with his life in London. In 1618, he was at the height of his fame and reputation. 2 years earlier, he had written his latest play, The Devil is an Ass, but it had failed badly, and he would not write another for 9 years. But he had also published a carefully prepared folio edition of his collected works, a unique experiment for the time, and continued to write very successful and profitable masques for the court. He must have felt more independent and free in 1618 than he had felt for a long time, but possibly he was left less satisfied than if his play had been a success. It rather depends on if he saw his work for the court as less valuable in an artistic sense than his work for the public playhouses. His visit might also have been prompted by some of the Scottish lords who frequented the English court issuing him pressing invitations to visit them at their northern homes. He was, after all, de facto the English poet laureate, and would have honoured any stately home with his presence. But again, if this was the sole purpose of his visit, why undertake to journey on foot? Whatever it is that prompted Jonson to make his journey to Scotland, and perhaps it was some combination of all of the above, it certainly was not the specific desire to see and stay with Drummond. Bishop Sage, in the biography he prefixed to the 1711 folio edition of Drummond's works, says expressly that Jonson came to Scotland on foot in the year 1619, on purpose to visit Drummond and stay some 3 or 4 weeks with him at Hawthornden. Every item in that sentence is open to question. It was certainly not 1619 when Jonson went to Scotland, and there is no evidence at all that Jonson and Drummond ever met or had any kind of communication before they met in Edinburgh. The exact duration of Jonson's stay at Hawthornden cannot be determined, but it is much more likely to have been 10 days or a fortnight rather than 3 or 4 weeks. Jonson had no intimate knowledge of Drummond, and it seems did not take any trouble to avoid hurting his feelings. For example, as Drummond reports it, he said of Sir William Alexander that he was not half kind unto him and neglected him, because a friend to Drayton. Sir William Alexander was Drummond's greatest friend, and he was close with Drayton too, as evidenced in a very friendly and mutually complimentary series of letters between Drummond and Drayton that are still extant. Jonson mentioned Drayton 4 times to Drummond in the conversations, and each time with a sneer, saying on one occasion, Drayton feared him, and he esteemed him not. From these passages, it is clear that Jonson either knew so little about Drummond that he didn't realise that these men were friends, or else he cared so little about Drummond's feelings that he didn't mind hurting them. Whichever was the case, it doesn't seem likely that Drummond was the magnetic gentleman of letters who drew Jonson 400 miles away from his library and his favourite tavern. So apparently, these two literary gentlemen sat in Drummond's library for several days and discussed life, literature, and the people they knew or knew of from the literary circle of early modern England. After Jonson had departed, Drummond wrote out the words that he remembered from their conversations, recording the thoughts of someone that, no doubt, he thought of as a truly great man of letters. Such recordings were part of Drummond's personality. He left long lists of all sorts of items, thoughts and personal experiences amongst his papers, so this was not out of character for him. In fact, there were so many papers left to his estate that the notes on Ben Jonson's visit were not discovered until the early 1700s, and were not even partly published until 1925. But the original notes were lost, and now we only have the transcription by the discoverer of the papers, Sir Robert Sibbald. Although it seems likely that Drummond formally recorded the conversation sometime after the event, it is not clear if he was working from notes taken at the time or purely from memory. Unfortunately, he gives us next to no context about the subject under discussion from which the quotes are extracted. In fact, pretty much all he does give us is pithy one-liners, a few sentences at best, that often leave us wondering what Jonson really meant. There is no indication of Jonson's different moods, the amount of drink consumed — Jonson was, by all accounts, a heavy drinker — or any other circumstances that might have explained some of the more surprising comments. So, for example, Drummond records that he recommended to my reading Quintilian, who, he said, would tell me the faults of my verses as if he had lived with me, and Horace, Plinius, Tacitus, Juvenal, and Martial, whose epigrams he had translated. So, apparently no feeling for his host's sensibilities there, and then he goes on to criticise other poets. His censure of the English poets was this, that Sidney did not keep a decorum in making everybody speak as well as himself. Samuel Daniel was a good, honest man, had no children, but no poet. That John Harrington's Ariosto, under all translations, was the worst. That when Sir John Harrington desired him to tell the truth of his epigrams, he answered him that he loved not the truth, for they were narrations and not epigrams. That next to himself, only Fletcher and Chapman could make a masque. Spenser's stanzas pleased him not, nor his matter, the meaning of which allegory he had delivered in papers to Sir Walter Raleigh. The meanings here are often obscure and sound like Drummond summarising longer and presumably more nuanced conversations. The last reference there is to Spenser's Faerie Queene. Spenser provided an explanatory prefix to his monumental work to aid the understanding of the reader, which was indeed passed to Sir Walter Raleigh. And then, most notoriously, Jonson is recorded by Drummond as having said that Shakespeare lacked art, and that Shakespeare, in a play, brought in a number of men saying that they had suffered shipwreck in Bohemia, where there is no sea near by 100 miles. I have mentioned that particular quote which refers to The Winter's Tale before, and pointed out a later critic's assertion that in fact Shakespeare was correct in the historical context of the play. Bohemia's territory at that time did stretch to the sea. Whatever the correctness of that particular case, these comments do seem to criticise Shakespeare in a rather grumpy and dismissive manner, a fact that enraged Victorian scholars, who by then had Shakespeare on a pedestal and did Jonson's reputation no good at all for a long time. all of which runs contrary to other evidence that we have about their relationship. Anecdotally, Jonson visited Shakespeare in Stratford just before he died, a death attributed in part to the heavy drinking session involved on that occasion. And more reliably, the praise of his departed friend in his very complimentary poem printed in the first folio, titled "To the Memory of the Author, my beloved Mr. William Shakespeare, and what he has left us." And the statement that, "For I love the man, and do honour his memory on this side of idolatry as much as any." In the Drummond papers, there are comments about other playwrights that seem to be similarly at odds with views he expressed elsewhere, or at least questionable, given he collaborated multiple times with these playwrights, that while in Scotland he seemed happy to jibe, gossip and snipe at. Drummond's record is perhaps more his own interpretation of Jonson's views than an unbiased record, which is unfortunate given that for a long time they were taken more or less at face value, especially as regards Shakespeare, and this may be unfair. At the very least, some of Jonson's views must have annoyed Drummond, and it's difficult to think that the way he recorded the comments is not coloured by his own views. Also, it has to be said that the whole authenticity of the document has been doubted by some scholars, given its late discovery and the lack of an original document confirmed to be in Drummond's hand. Although it could be a complete fabrication by Robert Sibbald, and there are some anomalies in the text that give rise to such suspicions, many scholars do consider the document reliable enough to be of interest to Jonson's biographers. What we can and can't trust from this document is important to research into the literary world of the period, because Jonson was an absolutely central figure in it. He was close to the king and the court, and, we have to assume, his opinion mattered. John Aubery's view of Ben Jonson in his brief lives was, he was, or rather had been, of a clear and fair skin. His habit was very plain. Which sort of continues the impression left by Drummond and others. Aubery was still a child when Jonson died, so as with many of his descriptions, he is speaking at best from second-hand information. Perhaps more reliable was Thomas Dekker's view, seeing as he must have known Jonson well. He described him as a starving leviathan with a terrible mouth, a beard afraid to peep out, a parboiled face punched full of oilet holes like the cover of a warming pan. Which leaves us with the feeling that Dekker didn't like Jonson very much, and was happy to turn him into some sort of grotesque. But then it was Dekker's way to caricature to the extreme, so perhaps this is not to be taken as harshly as it sounds. In fact, we know what Jonson looked like because there is a portrait of him that was probably painted around 1617, and unlike the portraits of Marlowe and Shakespeare, there has never been any question about the authenticity of its likeness. The portrait may once have been owned by James I's favourite, George Villiers, the first Duke of Buckingham, and it now resides in the National Portrait Gallery in London. It is the image that you see on most books about Jonson. Although he was certainly not painted for his beauty, the picture does show that those descriptions are quite unkind, and perhaps in Dekker's case, reflect his own skill at the pithy cutting comment, something he had in common with Jonson. So, given the uncertainty of Drummond's accounts, can we find the character of Jonson through his work? Notwithstanding the problems associated with this approach in general, there is a view that Jonson revealed himself through his work in a way that can never be said of Shakespeare. Although this does happen in his plays, it is primarily in his poetry that he appears to speak in the first person, and even when writing in the third person, he frequently refers to himself as the subject of the poem. The reader of his poetry is often left with the impression that, in many cases, the poem is to and about himself, to the extent that his name recurs often in his work. However, to counter this view, scholars suggest that this underestimates Jonson's ability as a creative writer of his time. To them, it seems more likely that when Jonson speaks of himself, it is an idealised view that he is expressing, and there is no reason to think that he espoused naturalism any more than any other poet or playwright of his time did. So, the suggestion here is that any consistency that we see in Jonson's life through his work is actually a fabrication of his art, and reading his life through his art is as difficult for him as it is for any other poet or playwright. A quite well-known fact about Jonson is that he was always very keen to show off his learning, to the extent that in his work he often takes on the persona of the poets that he admired and imitated, particularly Horace, Ovid, and the other Roman poets. Attempts to expressly create new work by old masters was not considered plagiarism at the time, but a legitimate form of poetry that advanced the form and displayed learning and admiration for those past masters. And by the by, it's interesting to note that it was Jonson who introduced the word plagiarism into the English language, taking it from the Latin plagiarus, meaning a body snatcher or kidnapper, but without many of its current negative connotations. The fact that Jonson subsumed his own personality into those of previous poets in his poems simply adds to the problem of interpreting his genuine views from within his work. This issue is also found in his most satiric plays, which we will get to, but just as an example for now, the comedy Poetesta from 1601 showed poetic activity in Rome during the early years following the fall of the Republic, but it was intended to reflect the events and people from contemporary London, with the character of Horace intended to depict Jonson himself. Although there were satiric counterblows from other playwrights, particularly Dekker and Chettle, as an immediate response to this play, they would in time praise Jonson as our English Horace, and as a playwright whose characters would never die. In 1640, 3 years after Jonson's death, his translation of The Art of Poetry by Horace was published with an engraved title page showing a bust of Jonson in the guise of Horace himself, Roman toga and an olive wreath included. If Jonson's aim was to become England's Horace, then it seems that for some at least he had achieved this. As his friend Lord Herbert of Cherbury wrote, "'Twas not enough, Ben Jonson, to be thought of English poets best, but to have brought in great estate to their acquaintance one made equal to himself and thee, that none might be thy second, while thy glory is to be the Horace of our times and his." But despite this layering of character within character in Jonson's work, there are times when we can with confidence see him explicitly through his plays. He uses prologues and epilogues, specially inserted scenes, choruses and other devices to make sure that his audience did not miss the point of his play, or the beauties that he had placed within them. To use Poetesta as an example again, there is a dialogue of apology appended to an early performance of the play, where a character called the author appears on stage to give those in the audience who might be less than appreciative of his work a stern talking to. Given that this seems to have been added for an early performance, it's possible that Jonson himself performed it. There are also characters who appear to take on Jonson's voice and act as a commentator on the play, or as a defence against anticipated critics. We should, of course, be cautious about taking these as completely autobiographical characters. They are, after all, embedded in a play, a fiction, and more often than not we more likely see aspects of Jonson's character and beliefs in various characters in the play, which he sets up in opposition to each other in order to progress a dramatic debate. When John Milton commented on the pleasures of London nightlife in his poem Allegro, first published in 1645, he, of course, made mention of the theatre. "Then to the well-trod stage anon, if Jonson's learned sock be on, or sweetest Shakespeare, fancy's child, warble his native wood notes wild." So once again, we have Jonson mentioned in the same breath as Shakespeare, and if anything, placed by Milton as Shakespeare's superior, and Milton was a huge admirer of Shakespeare. This also places Jonson in the context of performance, that well-trod stage, and that is significant. It addresses what is perhaps the crux of the current problem with Jonson. As essentially a comedic writer, his plays need to be seen to be fully appreciated. Comedy, especially 400-year-old comedy, does not jump off the page to the reader. But unfortunately, more often than not, reading Jonson is our only option, with a few exceptions. In his time, in Milton's time, the allusion to Jonson's learned sock was assumed to be understood, that Jonson took on the mantle of those ancient poets by donning the acting slippers used by Greek and Roman actors. The erudite Milton used the same allusion in his praise poem to Shakespeare that appeared in the second edition of Shakespeare's complete plays. And though thou hast more Latin and less Greek, from thence to honour thee I would not seek for names, but call forth thundering Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles to us. Or when thy socks are on, leave thee alone for the comparison of all that insolent Greece or haughty Rome set forth, or since did from their ashes come. And there we have the major issues that we now have with Jonson summarised. Most obviously, there is the contrast with Shakespeare, and then his display of his classicism and learning, and his expectation that his audience would follow his meaning. Of course, we have seen this in Shakespeare already, but Jonson turns it up a notch or two from that, and the evidence of his plays is that he did feel the need to give the audience a helping hand, and as I've already mentioned, it was not always done with good grace. However, we cannot get away from the fact that his many allusions and references need a hefty serving of footnotes. And that doesn't mean that it's just you and I that might find Jonson a difficult read. In 1919, T.S. Eliot said, "The reputation of Jonson has been of the most deadly kind that can be compelled upon the memory of a great poet. To be universally accepted, to be damned by the praise that quenches all desire to read the book, to be afflicted by the imputation of the virtues which excite the least pleasure, and to be read only by historians and antiquaries. This is the most perfect conspiracy of approval." Eliot has not been alone in that view by any means, and any comparison is almost always with Shakespeare's best comedies to put Jonson in a bad light. The counter-argument is that we should not compare the two. Jonson was working in a different tradition from Shakespeare, and his best comedies, Volpone and The Alchemist, are comic masterpieces that do not need comparison with others. Yes, Jonson worked in much narrower limits, and he does not transcend genres as successfully as Shakespeare does, but that does not make what he did produce of less interest or value. So Ben Jonson remains something of a puzzle for us, and one that, in a way, is made more complicated because we do know a few facts about his life. Shakespeare's life as a blank canvas can often prove an advantage. One of those facts was, of course, that Jonson was himself a player. Although he was reportedly not a very good one, we have to wonder how much we are being played when he reveals part of himself to us, be that through his plays, his poetry, or his conversations with his contemporaries. The degree to which Jonson was of a rather belligerent and sour character, or simply a playwright and poet who realised that he was perhaps the greatest artist of his day, yet willing to collaborate with others and to stretch the boundaries of early modern theatre to the extent that he was imprisoned and nearly executed for his pains, are difficult judgments to make. And for those reasons and many others, he remains a fascinating character to study, even from this distance. Next time, we will get into the details of Ben Jonson's life, as far as we know them, tracing him from his lowly beginnings to a life of privilege as a key part of the Stuart court under James I, which resulted in honours, a stipend for life, and the respect of the nobility. But along the way with that great success, there were also a few flops, imprisonment, marriage to an apparently shrewish wife, and, oh yes, the small business of a murder. In the meantime, please join the Facebook page or group or find the podcast on Instagram or X to keep up to date with new episodes and other theatre-related things. If you do feel able to help out with the costs of running the podcast, then please head over to Patreon, where we will find additional content for a small monthly fee or a one-off donation. You can also make a one-off show of support through Ko-fi.com. You can find the details of ways to support the podcast at the website, which is www.thehistoryofeuropeantheatre.com. That's also a great place to get in touch with me if you wish by using the contact form, or you can even leave me a voicemail by clicking on the microphone icon. I look forward to your company next time, but if you do have any comments or concerns in the meantime, you can also contact me by email at thoetp@gmail.com or via X at thoetp.